Okay, everybody, let's get this party started. Thank you so much for being here tonight in this uh, relaxed and educational conversation that we're going to have with the one and only Ted Fujimoto, my dear friend and colleague now for many years. It is a privilege for the University of Houston Clear Lake and the doctoral program in educational leadership to have Ted here with us. Like as I said it in the invitation, his background is extremely impressive and impactful in the educational world. He has not only advised multi-million dollar corporations and how to get better, but also he has done a lot of work in the educational world to make it better and help students. And so we feel extremely lucky to have him, and he's a very busy individual, and giving us couple of minutes to us is something that we appreciate a lot. And so with that said, that this is guys, and this is going to be a conversation. It's going to be a kind of a podcast for you guys, and if you have any questions or stuff like that or comments while we're talking here, just feel free to write it in the chat or even just jump in. But with that said, that why don't we open up by letting the audience know a little bit about yourself, and your career, and how do you get to where you are right now?
Thanks, Antonio. Good to meet everybody. Very happy to be here. Dr. Corrales and I have been talking about doing this for probably over a year or so. We could never get the schedules to work out, so I'm just really happy that we were able to make this happen. And any friend and colleague of Dr. Corrales is a friend of mine, so happy to be here. Uh, I have there's a few experiences that have shaped me and brought me to where I'm at, and that's relevant, especially around the transformation of education systems. The first thing is that I grew up as an expat kid, so I had all kinds of different experiences with education, from private school, public school, single room country schoolhouse, private tutors, correspondence school where you actually had to do your assignments, mail them, and 3 weeks later they come back graded. Uh, and and I look at my education experience, even up as an adult, and through some of the things that the different iterations of my work. And I can probably count on one hand the certain teachers in the certain classes, and this includes higher education as well, that were actually useful. And even to this day, I look at most of it as it was kind of a waste of time and something that you tolerated. And as a kid, um, one thing that was unusual is my parents were they basically said, do your best work, and they always, whatever interest I had, they would try to do the best they could to enable me to pursue that until I burnt out on it. And very unusual kind of background, and that was kind of a gift because when I was an expat kid as a teenager in Japan, I'd get done all my studies by 10 o'clock in the morning, and I would just hop on the subway, explore the city, meet all kinds of people. The only rule was come back by dinner. And I met some interesting people, including the general manager of the largest Apple distributor, which Apple, Japan was the first market that Apple really entered into. And so he said, "Hey, Ted, come look at the new computer that we got." It was the first Macintosh that ever showed up in Japan. "Hey, play with that. Tell me what you think," right? Um, so I have all these kind of interesting intersects with interesting people over my career. But to long story short, um, I started my first company in my freshman year of college. And my first clients, kind of being in the right place at the right time, was Remy Martin, LVMH, Airtouch Communications, which then became Vodafone, which is now known as Verizon, I'm going to share a screen with you just because I think it's illustrative a little here. And we were building logistics and finance systems. So, for example, air touch communications, they were building cell phone networks from scratch in 58 countries. And I was freshman, sophomore in college, and was paired up with this MBA guy, and we had to figure out how to build their systems. Um, by the time I graduated college, had 26 employees, and we were winning awards. We would learn brand new industries, we would learn brand new technologies, build actual solutions in those technologies. That some of them were pre-release, and they would be exhibited in Microsoft and IBM's executive briefing centers for over a decade. And I say this in context because when it comes to technology, we could basically do anything with it. Beat it into submission and make it work. There was one client of mine that that I had over a decade, and they had a 35-year history of transforming retail networks. They're the ones who are hired by General Motors to come up with a Saturn car company retailing concept. And they re-engineered 11 automotive and hospitality brands, including some of the transformative work of Ritz-Carlton when they went from few locations. And in about early 1980s, they went from 35,000 people to over 75,000 people, doubled their network. Almost every one of their locations was in an island in the middle of the Pacific or some island. And they were the first five-star hotel on the island. They had to hire the majority of the island who lived in huts at that point. And Ritz-Carlton had to deliver a five-star world-class experience from day one. How do you do that? And this group, Dice Group, was instrumental in understanding that culture and systems and alignment of systems could happen with intentionality. How do you get a bunch of redneck, bullheaded, stubborn auto dealers to do something completely different than they've done for generations and replicate that 1,100 times in like 5 years? That's what Saturn was all about. And in the mid 90s, I ended up selling my technology companies. I had an opportunity to actually own part of this group. And that was transformative for the rest of kind of my career leading up to this point. It was the idea that, technology, we can figure it out and it changes and you can beat it into submission. But what is it about human performance and organizational performance, and why can't organizations get from point A to point B, especially when they set out a bunch of goals? So as an example, Land Rover for decades has been at the bottom 5 worst.
Hey.
Yes.
Messing with you. You know why?
Oh yeah, you have
He
one.
takes great he
So
takes
some
great
people have
pride.
higher tolerance. Yeah, Dr. Krause has one. But they've always been at the bottom, the worst defects of any brand of car manufacturers, bottom 5. And the line workers and executives at Land Rover never wake up every day to say, we want to make the most effective car of all the brands. And they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to fix that, and they would bump up for a few years, and then it would slide back down. And hundreds of millions of dollars trying to fix this. They did more inspections, they did more quality control procedures, they did all these things, but something was always missing. And this has a strong analogy to any organization, and especially schools, around your mission and visions. Because I have never seen even an F-rated school district that says we wake up every day trying to hurt kids. All the mission statements say exactly the same thing. So big picture here, everybody has great goals. So what really makes a difference between the ones who are able to actually achieve high results versus ones who don't. It's not the goals, it's their execution and agility. Well,
Sorry, Ted. I think you got muted. Sorry. There
so
you go. There you go.
backtracking on a timeline a little bit, in the early 1990s, I decided to move my company from Silicon Valley to Napa Valley, where I was from. And there were about 5 or 6 other biotech tech companies that decided to do the same thing. And Napa Valley, of course, beautiful area to live. However, at the end of the day, it's a farm town. And we got into it in about a year and started to realize that we would probably have a really hard time expanding because we couldn't hire anybody. It was a farm town. So we went to the community college and the school district to say, what are you going to do about this? Because we need to develop workforce if we're going to stay here. Otherwise, we literally have to start making plans to move somewhere else. And at that time, Nampa Unified School District was a bit overcrowded. And so they gave, this is kind of a once in a, this is kind of right time, right place, where they allowed us to design an alternative high school. And you know, it kind of ended up in my lap and say, what do you want to see? Well, remember, this is a kid who hated school. So, but we needed employees. So what ended up happening is we've shaped a alternative high school. We needed employees, so we made it 11th and 12th grade, end of the pipeline, right? What kind of kids? Obviously, we didn't know what we were doing, because what kind of kids you think shows up, leaving their current high school in the middle of high school experience and going to a different school? Well,
Right.
we ended up with C and below kids, failing kids.
Hmm.
And how we designed the school was simply, well, I know what my high performance teams in my company look like. I know what protocols they use. I know what kind of culture is needed to create that high performance, think creatively, really learn, like breaking edge things. And so we basically put all those protocols and tools into that school. That became one of the first iterations of a whole school use of project-based learning. Even some of the project-based learning protocols and the terminology of know and need to know and social agreement and contracts, all those were actual terms we used in our projects. Well,
Hmm.
long story short, 60 days after opening the school, total chaos, but we had to kick half the kids out of the building at 7:30, 8:30 at night. They wouldn't leave.
Hmm.
And these are the kids who hated school, right?
Hmm.
So that, and I bring that up because that was a really important aha for me around the power of intrinsic motivation and the need for that to inspire good performance and actually do good work. Well, 9 months later, because in that time California had an alternative assessment system for alternative kids, so in schools, so it wasn't really high stakes. They didn't really have to take much high stakes testing, but we said, yeah, take the standardized test. Let's see what happens. We didn't teach them, we didn't prepare them to take the test or anything. Well, they outscored every single high school in the county by 10 to 15%. This
Hmm.
is within the first year,
That's
right?
insane.
And total chaos. And then I got pissed off because I knew that we didn't know what we were doing. It was just some basic principles around creation of the right protocols and ways of unpacking problems, projects, a culture that of trust, respect, and responsibility, and do what you say you're going to do. That what made my teams successful and what we did. And everything else was pretty flawed. It was chaos,
Hmm.
right? But yet you could create this high performance. Well, long story short, that became the New Tech Network with all the New Tech schools. They have over 350 schools around the country, a huge concentration in Texas, as you know.
Hmm.
And then Big Picture Learning also with similar ideas started about this at the same time. And we took what we learned from Ritz-Carlton and all the retail network engineering process of culture, the intentionality of creation of culture and mindset and alignment of systems. And those became the underpinnings of those organizations that have
Mm,
scaled and sustained their work for now over 2.5 decades. I had
mm,
the opportunity to apply that to some of the first generation charter management organizations, mostly in California and in New York. And those are remain the strongest, larger networks that have served some of the urban populations in some of the toughest school districts in the country.
mhm.
So that there's a couple of big ahas for me in this.
Okay, but before you
Yes.
go though, so so first of all, that's freaky that you were able to accomplish that, especially within the realities of bureaucratic realities of public education and ruling and all the things that we all know here in this forum that you have to deal with regularly, right? So, kind of following up into that one, because you're I think for this particular crowd, I think it's important to contextualize some of your aha moments within that experience, but more importantly, your aha moments advising high level organization and your own organizations to moving from goal setting towards towards realities. And I think you have impacted my life so much in that area. And guys, for disclaimer, everybody knows me here, but for disclaimer, when I met Ted and he started educating me about his process, my learning process was becoming asymptotic. I was honestly bored hearing the same stuff over and over again and kind of recycling the same things. I was going to conferences to network, but I wasn't feeling like I was learning stuff. And when Ted, share his system with me and actually train me on that, and I combine it with my old background, I start seeing things completely different. So, Ted, why don't you tackle that part from talking about goal setting and without satanizing goal setting? How do you move from goal settings towards reality, especially within high level organizations like the Amazons of the world, the Googles of the world, like those who deliver results year after year after year?
So a big impact was our experience with Ritz-Carlton, because you could have the same buildings, different five-star groups can have different to have the same kind of aesthetic of buildings. And we all know when we go to a hotel or a restaurant, how long does it take you to know if something's a little off, right? You're not might
Right,
not be an expert who be
right away. Yeah, right away.
right.
Almost.
It's right away.
Right.
And so one of the big principles that I learned early on was the idea of a brand promise. So when you think of Ritz-Carlton, when you think of Emirates Airways, when you think of certain very powerful brands, something very specific comes to mind. And if there's a misalignment to that brand promise, it's an erosion of trust, right? If you walk into Ritz-Carlton and everything's dirty, it'd be erosion of trust. You say something is
Mm,
wrong. It didn't line up to my expectations.
mm,
And that is one really common element of some of the most powerful brands and the most powerful schools is that even the kids, even the parents are so clear on what's being promised them, right? But to promise people good customer service, for example, everyone says they want to give good customer service. Everyone says they want to deliver good cars. So, and no one says we want to deliver you a terrible defective car every time, or we want to hurt kids, or we don't want to prepare kids for life, or we don't want, no one says that, right? So the difference between high performing organizations and mediocre ones is about the consistency and preciseness of execution and their agility. That's it.
mm,
The goals don't matter. So if you actually look at all of, I've worked with tons of districts, tons of education organizations, and their mission statements look almost exactly the same. Yes, they tweak it, they emphasize this, they emphasize that, but at the end of the day, I don't see anyone say I want to hurt kids. So let's get past that. How are you going to actually deliver? Just like everyone says, we want good customer service. Great. What are you going to actually execute as an individual and as a team to guarantee that promise every single day? Whenever you walk into the school, whenever you walk into the classroom, what is that kid going to experience? And that hyper focus of delivering on that brand promise is probably the biggest missing ingredient in most educational experiences, because we rely so much on good intention and goals and hope that it will get there, right?
And but you mentioned something in there that to me is an open eye, right? So number one is when you're talking about execution, and we can elaborate even on that. But I think another keyword you said is how agile, how adaptable you are as organization. And let's be honest, in education, maybe because of ego, maybe because of mental laziness, maybe because of comfort zone, we tend to be very rigid, and we hear a lot of time the typical answer, hey, we're just doing this because that's the way that we have been doing it all the time or for years, and oh, this is going to be a political nightmare doing this and that. uh, Based on your experience, how do you move organizations that traditionally work in ISO and silos, and see goal settings as the ultimate step? How do you work with them? How do you transform them from point A to point B with those parameters? Execution and agility.
So when an organization is trying to improve their performance, goal setting has kind of a very perverse and inverse set of effects. Let me give you an example. So let's say a department or team is asked to set a goal. Let's say, well, for the business plan or for the strategic plan.
Mm,
Well, smart teams are probably going to say, let's give a goal that one is we can actually achieve, and we're going to lower that goal to a way that we can safely achieve.
mm,
Or we're going to set a goal that we're not going to be too ambitious because that won't give us enough headroom for next year to continue to grow if we overachieve this year, because then what happens if we flatline next year, right?
mhm.
So the whole notion of a goal ends up actually dumbing down the capability of an organization to the lowest common denominator that everyone can tolerate.
Well, and I think one example that you and I have always talked about is, remember when we had the ESSER funds and the
Mhm.
bailouts, and then you have, for example, educational vendors who sold millions of dollars with that, and they raised their standard within the organization, and all of a sudden, with those ESSER funds ran out, their sales dropped,
Mhm.
and then they were punished because
Yeah,
of that.
and those are external environmental things that is not in their control, right?
Right.
They could have anticipated it, and this is the inverse, thing of goal setting. The other thing that happens is they might set really high goals, but if they set it high enough or too high collectively as a collection of teams, and everyone knows that it's going to get impacted, but they'll have enough political fire cover and explanations to basically make it okay that they didn't actually hit those goals,
So, like,
right?
failure is not an option, and
Yeah.
100% passing rate star
Mhm.
test, for example,
Yeah.
when they're at 53% the former year or something like that.
Now, believe me, there needs to be benchmarks for organization performance. So there's two kind of ways to go. There's two kind of legs to that stool, and I'll go through that. But
Mm.
the if you so there's a polarity of leadership and accountability that we found so different in all kinds of organizations, including schools, and you can walk in and within 5 minutes, you can kind of tell which polarity it is. And it's either goal-based accountability as one polarity or execution-based accountability as the
Mm,
other polarity. And what an execution-based accountability environment looks like is if we all have a project together, um, if and we're coordinating what our execution pathway is, if I know that Antonio is going to do exactly what he says he's going to do when he says he's going to do it, and I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do, and everyone on this call is on it as part of the team, we can trust that we're going to have perfect execution of actions, not goals, actions. We as a team can collectively have a hypothesis of what we believe the outcome and the result of our actions will be.
mhm.
And 9 times out of 10, we will be right and blow past that because we can rely on execution.
Yeah, but what you taught me also,
Hmm?
this is two important points to follow up with that because I think this is critical for the discussion. Is number one, even if you don't achieve that particular outcome, nobody's in trouble if everybody did what they promised they were gonna do. That's number one. And the second aspect that I think um, is important is that those those actions that you promise to take have mitigated risk. In other words, you're never gonna compromise the baseline of the organization, and I think that's a critical point that you educate me on, because when you say taking risk, or you say failure is part of the process. Yes, but also mitigated fail, mitigate risk. In other words, you're like you said, risk carton is not going to compromise the well-being, the baseline of the organization for specific
So,
risk
yeah.
taker measures.
So this is where there's several legs to this table, right? For the
Mm,
table to stand. So number one is execution-based accountability. I will take any day a flawed strategy that's perfectly executed than a perfect strategy that's half executed, because the one who's half executing is probably going to have much higher propensity of actually failing. The second part of this is that you don't want there's when you're doing something truly innovative and breakthrough, there's no such thing as a perfect plan. There's too many things outside of our control. The problem
mm,
with most strategic planning processes is that we hyper focus on all the things that we can control and everyone feels comfortable in talking about. Well,
mm,
the biggest opportunities and the biggest risks lie in all the stuff that we actually don't know much about, and we're
mm,
underestimating and underappreciating or don't even see, right?
mm,
So
mm,
I almost don't care what you know. I'm more concerned about what is it that we don't know. And there's some things that is impossible to actually know, or it's too expensive to know. And those are risks.
mm,
And some help us focus in and say, if we're going to embark on this pathway, we better figure this out, right?
mm,
Because you don't want anything fatal. So
mm,
so this brings up the whole importance of iteration, because
mm,
when you are doing something truly innovative, you're too often we try to make these multi-year plans. And
mm,
there's so much of the external risk and environmental changes that can impact those plans that we can't foresee that. But we
mm,
know what kind of skills we can build and how we respond to those and what our actions can be to navigate down that path. So when it comes to execution-based accountability, it is about creating an agreed set of execution as an individual and as a team that is a reasonable next steps that we can safely form a hypothesis of what we think the result is. And if we
mm,
don't get the result, guess what? What we can all ask each other, what did we miss? And
mm,
what kinds of steps and actions can we take, execution can we take to, based on that learning, to then get a better result, right? So it allows for natural iteration and to Contrast that with the goal-based accountability, where you have this hypothetical goal or the super goal, and everyone's trying to kind of go into their silos to try to come up with their ways that they can either make the goal, make themselves look good, or dummy down the goal, or create a collective action where there's so much external risk. Of course, no one could make the goal, and we made some progress toward the goal, and everyone pats each other on the back, right? So,
Right.
so
But
that's
so number one, I'm assuming that these high level organizations who who and I'm assuming I know because you and I have worked on this, that those high level organizations are pretty systematic on this iteration process
yeah, the iteration process.
iteration process of brainstorming. One caveat. So number one, they're pretty systematic. Maybe you do it every week. Maybe you do it, I don't know, once a day, whatever.
Yes.
Uh, but the second part is how do they avoid fatal errors? Because I think that's where the different you and I have talked about that different in Formula One. For example, you brought this example all the time. Formula One, you have these racing cars who are unbelievable, and they always try to innovate. But the bottom line is they're never gonna lower the expected standards of being within certain number of seconds of completing the laps, for example.
Right.
So how do you get to that point?
So the aspirational piece. So it's two legs to that. Number one is being very clear about your brand promise. So as Ritz-Carlton, a brand, there's a certain set of expectations and promises embedded in that brand, which is, 5 star of everything, 5 star building, 5 star food, 5 star service, right? But then if you look at a Hilton Garden Inn or Courtyard, right? Those have specific brand promises for practicalness, affordability, convenience. You know exactly what you're getting. It's simple. It's not fancy, right? And that's geared toward a particular type of customer and their needs. So brand promise, being very clear about that is important. The second leg to that is what we call calibration experiences.
Mhm.
And what does it take to be a world-class Ritz-Carlton? What does it take to be a world-class Hilton Garden Inn? Right? Two different kinds of calibration, but there's some commonality in mindset, in service, in customer care, and how they execute. That you can have a poorly run 5 star hotel. You can have a poorly run 3 star hotel, right?
Mhm.
So what is very common um, is a very routine calibration experience. So Ritz-Carlton, one of their design elements, non-negotiable and timeless, is that at the beginning of every shift of every day for 15 minutes, each team is required to basically have a circle time, and they reflect on the mindset of ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen,
Mhm.
because that is a big idea that encompasses a whole bunch of things. It doesn't say you have to smile at a guest within 6 seconds and then walking in the door,
Mhm.
right? Because that's very procedural and rote.
Mhm.
Ladies and gentlemen, serving ladies and gentlemen is a degree of world-class care that inspires. It covers so many things, and a lot of the accountability is use your best judgment, but share how you exhibited that value. So in this 15 minutes, each of the team members shares how I demonstrated the idea of ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen, how I observed my team doing it, and how I can up my game, and what opportunities my team has to up our game to reach that mind, that the world-class mindset of that. And
But those are good times because I'm sure they're pretty systematic as you're describing it. You have to have the right mindset for that. And I think this is the perfect opportunity for you to, in a brief way, introduce a concept to the audience that really changed my life, which was the task mode and the default mode of the brain. Because a lot of people who are here have no idea. that you have those two modes constantly operating in your brain. And we tend, because a lot of the people who are here are overachievers, they tend to think that they can be effective in default mode when they're in task mode. And that's not the case. So, can you kind of introduce that concept so that people
Okay.
can understand?
So when so with the Ritz-Carlton piece, just to finish that up. So they
Sure.
share that reflection. The very best, most powerful story that comes out of that team, they're required to put into a system so that it gets curated worldwide. So every day there's some worldwide where Ritz-Carlton brand says, this is an exemplary example story about how someone, including a janitor, exhibited this mindset of ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. And that becomes a calibration experience. Because think about, let's say, a new manager that just got hired by Ritz-Carlton that came from a less functional hotel. Everyone says, oh, yeah, you're empowered, to provide good customer care. But, the first instinct of people is basically say, I don't believe it. Or let me see and test the system to see where it breaks and I get in trouble because I did too much, right? So everyone kind of holds back. And the manager might try to hold back their team. But when Ritz-Carlton is celebrating something at a high level of the story, it really sets a calibration, the bar, at a much more consistent and higher level than it happening by chance. Now, this
Right.
goes into what Antonio was leading up to, is 10 years ago we didn't have technology affordable technology that we could do real-time imaging of people's brains, when you're thinking certain thoughts and doing certain things, what that actually how that activates.
And by the way, guys, I have to say that this concept, and I'm not exaggerating here, this concept, once I digested it, it changed my life forever because I start scheduling my meetings. I start approaching my life with this mindset of default mode and task mode that I never had before in my life. And to be honest, my productivity increased probably in 30-40% just by implementing this.
So task mode is when you're doing conscious tasks. Default mode is when you go into a mindless state, when you're not focused on tasks. Okay. It's not left or right brain. It's how the brain activates. Now, if you look at the nodes, the portions of the brain that get activated under task mode, you can see it's kind of spread out, and there's some lines of connectivity on how the brain activates. When you're in default mode, you can see it's a whole bunch of other regions light up and a much denser set of neural pathways that light up. Okay, so there's a few things that are fascinating about this. Most people, it takes 3 hours to switch between default mode and task mode. It's like a dimmer switch, it's not a light switch. For super creatives, it can take 3 or more days to make the switch. So the studies have
Wow,
been,
that's freaky. So, for example, somebody like, let's say, I don't know, Warren Buffett, or let's say Bezos, or I don't know, Picasso. In your Picasso, so in your studies, those guys can take, or Rene Brown, they can take 3 days, for example, trying to get their right mindset to get into the full creative mode of default mode.
it's yeah, and it's interesting because high performance individuals, when we've been talking to them, many of them have these weird rituals and ways that they're hacks to switch modes, right? That's reliable to them.
For
Uh,
example, for example.
so let me ask this for the audience. When you've had a very complex problem and you had an epiphany, what were you doing?
Not something productive,
Okay.
like driving in the car. I mean, like mindlessly driving to work and it
Yep.
just hits you. Or brushing your teeth. I've had that before too, brushing my teeth.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I've
I
had the early
I'm sorry.
morning brainstorming
Mhm.
and implement something at work that actually works out.
Mm-hmm.
I am constantly reflecting on it because I'm thinking, wait a minute, I've been here before. I've said this before. Something is, I'm just thinking I have a premonition about something. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
often just reflective.
So we did interviews of some a docuseries about super creatives around the world, different industries, award-winning people. And we were shocked about the number of people that they said, yeah, when I have a troubling problem, I either take a nap or I might be in a shower for 3 to 5 hours. Like I literally bought a unlimited water heater, have a waterproof pen and paper in the shower, and that's how I solve problems. And so it turns out that our deepest thinking happens when you're default mode in a mindless
But
state.
Chad, this is such a hard pill to swallow for old school people who think that the way that they solve problems by working hard and being in
Mhm.
task mode 24/7. And these people literally create environments where they're not doing anything
That's
but
right.
meditative, relaxing, systematic way of creativity. So do you see the paradigm that a lot of educators face when they have been taught their whole life that
Or even corporate culture. Think about how meeting agendas are made for an hour meeting.
right,
You know,
right,
so let me ask a few questions. So if you know it takes the average person 3 hours to switch to optimize in each of those modes, if you're in default mode, how many task-based interruptions can you have before it destroys your entire day?
that's
Right?
right.
It's brutal. And so super creatives, and this doesn't mean they're the artists and the writers and all that, but it can be, the financial strategists, everything. They have sacred time and space to give themselves that space to be in specific modes without interruption so they can maintain that. Now, there are some people that are highly energetic and productive, hyper productive, that don't do that. But what we have found is they're leaving a lot of capacity on the table when they do that. It looks like they're
Bingo,
more
bingo,
productive, but the reality
bingo,
is they're not.
bingo. But you're hitting the nail. It doesn't mean that you cannot do the full mode. It just means that you don't do it at full capacity or a capacity level that you can fully develop your productivity. And I think that's the key concept in here that you hit in the nail, which is if you don't systematically adopt your calendar, your daily approach or your weekly approach to leave space for the full mode task, then you're gonna be immersed in constant task mode and you're gonna diminish significantly your capacity to create and solve problems. Either you're in sales, either you're in strategic planning, or either you're in finance. That makes sense?
So the study of the things that occur when you're in default mode. Um, so when you are listening to music, of course, when you're listening to stories and you're captivated by a story, your default mode lights up. When you're reflecting on your past and when you're projecting to the future, planning, right, is default mode activity. When you are trying to connect with another human and you're exhibiting empathy, that is a default mode activity. So it's safe to say that almost every executive function of the brain, of the deepest work and learning of the brain, happens in when you're in default mode, not task mode. Now it's interesting. You have brain dysfunctions, like when someone has PTSD and a traumatic experience in an instant. Basically creates neural pathways that just a smell or sound can trigger you, and you might even know that it's triggering you, right? And the point here is that neural pathways get created in an instant if the experience is strong enough. And what ends up happening is that people with PTSD, if you think about people with PTSD, when they reflect on their past, when they look to the future, when their relationships, those are all traumatic things, right? Negative, negative, negative. And so it's no surprise that people with PTSD tend to become OCD, because what it happens is that that's all task mode stuff. They shut down their default mode because it's too painful. It doesn't heal it. It just is alleviating. So that's where you see a disproportionate people with PTSD and doing yoga, martial arts, doing other things. But what's interesting about that crowd is that they're doing it from, like, they're doing martial arts from a task side. They can be technically really good, but they will never become a master. Now, or let's say they say, "Oh, I want to learn how to play the piano," so they get trained and classically trained, and they're technically good on the piano, but they're coming out of task mode. There could be we listen to them, it's like, that was technically really good, but something is missing. But then you have a master pianist, martial art, and it comes from a completely different place. It's almost effortless. It's almost mindless. It's like, wow, it same thing, but sounds so different. It comes from a different place because they're coming out from a default mode.
Okay,
So,
but so in high level organizations, I'm talking about like the best performing organization in the world. I'm assuming that they have not only one person, but they have the entire organization understanding this dynamic, even if they don't know the concept per se. They balance this dynamic pretty well systematically between default mode and task mode, right?
so
All the
yeah.
employees, what I'm saying.
Yeah, so it's always messy, right? Because most organizations don't understand this. So what ends up happening is your most super productive people in your organizations, and the highest performing people, whether it be in sales or whether it be in finance, whether they're a hedge fund quant or whatever, they will force their way to create a certain space for them. So don't bother me for 3 days. I'm going to disappear. Or they create their own environment as best they can to get the space that they need. But why do people have to fight for it, right? It's
I remember you talk about, you gave an example about coders and software programmers that you don't want to bother, almost like they don't even want to eat when they're doing all
yeah.
the stuff. And
Mhm.
the company learned not to mess with them. Like talking
Mhm.
about the Facebook or all those levels coders.
So so this is not an argument for task mode side of the brain is negative, because at some point you have to execute, right? But what you're executing has to be thought through. And that thinking through comes out of default mode, not out of task mode. So it's important to know the switches. It's important to know how to structure your team's thinking process to optimize the type of work that needs to get done. So this is why Ritz-Carlton, at the very beginning of every day, especially what they need is empathy with guests, attentiveness to guests. These are all default mode type of activities, right? And skills, the side of the brain. So it's really important for them, no matter what's been going on at work, or at home, coming to work, to be very to kind of place that and calibrate around the idea of ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen
And and
before they even interact with the first guest.
that to me is so masterful because it is this systematization of the understanding how to trigger the default mode or the execution mode in the right way by what you talk about neural pathways, right? Uh, Now, I don't. By the way, guys, for disclaimer, Ted and I are working on a project that's going to be a surprise coming soon. It's going to address all these because we're working on how to articulate this to education. Ted is super passionate about that. Passionate about that. But Ted, I don't want the time to run out without you giving us your take on the current stage of public education. You know, there obviously there we have the majority here, people here are public educators who love children, who love their profession, and currently is under attack. And one thing that one thing that I say to and I say I've been saying to my students and my friends is like we need to close the gap between the way that public schools and public entities in higher education are managed versus in comparison with high level entities in private education, in the private sector. And I say this candidly, people cannot do what they don't know. So a lot of our educational leaders who are my friends, they got there because they work hard, they know how to educate children, they know how to manage people, but they had never been taught how to manage high level corporation. All of a sudden, they're over multi-million dollar corporations and they don't really know how to handle that. And you see then departments in public schools working in isolation. You see the organizational politics consuming those superintendents, and 2 3 years they get fired, and then you start the cycle all over again. And that's why you see the massification of vouchers in some states and all this stuff. So um, first, your take on where we are in public education, the future, and how do we fix this mess?
Yeah, we're going to do this all in the next. Um, let me lay some foundational things. It kind of bridges from what we were talking about just previously. So, kind of going to this, remember we talked about PTSD, right? And how it instantly creates neural pathways. So, the beautiful part of the brain is that it creates neural pathways instantly with a strong experience. So there is a way to create life-changing, organizational changing, team-changing behaviors, not by inspection and telling them you've got to do better customer service, do this, do that, you got to do better because, Land Rover, that didn't work, right? Just to say do better. Everyone wants to do better, but they just, and they work harder and harder trying to do better, but it's not the right actions because one is they haven't given themselves the space and time to actually figure out better ways. But more importantly, we can use PTSD in a very positive way. So think about over your career, it could be professional or personal, where you've experienced something that was life-changing for you. And you might not have liked it, but you can't unlearn it, unsee it. It permanently created neural pathways that you're looking at something differently. So I'm going to give you my examples. So one, I had a client that had a last minute trip that had to fly me to Dubai. And they put me on Emirates Airways first class to do that. It was like $40,000 ticket, right? Of course, I
Wow.
would never pay that. It's not worth it for 12 hours for that, right? However, believe me, you do that. No, a United, Delta, American first class, it looks like flying in a woodshed compared
What
to
about the spirit? I'm just
or Breaker Spirit Airlines, right? It feels like because you can't unexperience that, you can't unsee that, right? And the other calibration experience that impacted me was the experience of we were very hyper aware that we didn't know what we were doing when we launched the first new tech as alternative school in the 11th, 12th grade, right? But to see those students become so engaged and not taking years, but literally in 60 days, and then they outscored academically 9 months later, and as a network now with 350 schools, and a third of them are hardcore urban, and some of them are rural, and some of them are suburban. This process works for all kinds of kids, right? And to flip that on, all our notions on end, realize there is a way to do this, and that helped me. Like I can't unsee that, I can't unexperience that. So looking to districts and to schools, and I've worked with hundreds of them around the country. The number one most profound experience is a calibration experience, and they cannot unsee it, undo it, and it launches them in a completely different trajectory, is when they experience as a team and as a community a world-class school. About a decade ago, I was doing a lot more of this, where we're hosting all these study tours of schools around the country and in other countries for education teams and communities. And it was astounding to me how many superintendents and school leaders have, they have never actually experienced and stepped inside a world-class school. They might have read about it, they might have heard lectures, they've gone workshops, they might even had a video conference with them, but they never really experienced it, right? As
They have only read it in theory, but they have never
academic.
seen it with their own eyes, them or
That's
their
right.
community. Okay.
Because when a community comes together, so superintendent, teacher leaders, principals, community business leaders, civic leaders,
Board
50
members.
of them, 25, 50 of them have spent a day at, let's say, two of these different types of schools, or even different types of execution, different models. They come back, and that's when things start moving, like really quickly. And we call that calibration experience. And it completely resets. These are communities that haven't been able to accomplish anything for decades.
And that's a tool to bypass bureaucracy and policies.
They
and all
figure
this
it
stuff.
out because they see the world differently and they saw it together. So that's what we call calibration experience. And it needs to be powerful organizations and teams always figure out how to do it, like religiously, on a routine basis. They can do small ones within, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, but then at least once a year, they do some profound ones to say, as a district, what's the world-class schools doing that we should expect, right? Or experience. And it does set a completely different calibration to the work, and it breaks through a lot of the opposition because people are afraid of stepping out without seeing what you're stepping out toward, right? We all are running away from bureaucracy. We're running away from assessments. We're running away from all kinds of stuff that keeps chasing us from that standpoint, but no one knows what they're running to. And that was also a big aha. So this goes to the education reform part. I've been very much part of the charter school movement in helping them grow for high quality growth. Help 16 state associations get legs underneath them to figure out how to best support the charter movement. And I will be the first one I'm known for this position is like the New Tech Network and the big picture. Those are all district schools. There are very few charter schools in those networks. So my work is probably, when you look at quantity of kids and number of systems, is in more on the public education district side, not the charter side, right? And I would say that the majority of the charter movement was built around the drive for autonomy and flexibility, but they didn't know what they were wanting the autonomy and flexibility for. There were some outliers that took that autonomy and flexibility and did amazing things. And I've been fortunate over the years to work with many of them, and their work withstands test of time and test of boards, test of changes in leadership, right? But the majority of the innovation projects and even the charter world has been a run toward autonomy, but they're not knowing what they're running to. So that's where the most powerful thing is around always having a team.
That's super powerful what you're saying. In other words, like a teacher saying, "Give me freedom to do whatever I want to do in the classroom." Then when you give the freedom, they're asking, "Hey, you're not gonna give me a scope and sequence. You're not gonna
Right?
give me lesson
Yeah.
plans. You're not gonna tell me what to do. So do you want autonomy or you don't want autonomy? What do you want? As long as your kids can meet these standards, you do whatever you want."
When you have a struggling group of teachers that spends a day or two with one of the world-class teams, teaching teams in another school, in another state or another country, they will never be able to work together and do the same thing the way that they've done before. Even if they don't like the idea that they are uncomfortable with change, they can't unsee it. That's the fastest way to performance improvement. So as a school leader, as a district leader, as a team leader, when you get into the execution-based accountability environment, it becomes so refreshing because your role is to create the sacred space and time to get the right people in the room, use of protocols, and to be one of the master concierge of calibration experience that blow people's minds of what world-class is. And that creates more performance improvement and sustained results than any number of inspections and classroom inspections and curriculum inspections that a school can do, because people start playing games when you do that.
So you and I have talked about the concept of strategic planning as a tool, because a strategic plan is mandated for most public schools and public universities and public community colleges in the nation. You and I have talked about utilizing strategic planning as an infiltrator to not only increase capacity, but being able to scale a system that can save public education and uh, public higher ed institutions. How do we get that done in your vision, in a scalable way? How do we accomplish what you're saying here in a scalable way so we can save public education and avoid a self-destruction within the next years?
So number one is start asking the question across stakeholders on what the brand promise is for what the district needs to deliver to the community, to the state, right? To kids. And that's a tricky conversation, but it can't happen in a vacuum. So the way you don't make it happen in a vacuum is to have your community and representatives from the community go visit some of the world-class execution of public education, or even private education, see what we're up against. Like, I just learned, my calibration experience recently is I talked to one of the heads of Chinese network of public schools in Beijing, and realized that some of their STEM-based high school, when they say real world learning, they have an NVIDIA level semiconductor fabrication unit inside their high schools, that if a kid comes up with an idea, they can actually fabricate it to commercial standards.
Wow.
Right? It's like, wow, well, that's a calibration experience. I don't know of any public school that can afford that in the US because of, different forms of governments and budgeting, but that's what we're up against. That's the competition. Right. I also understood, and it was a recent realization that the Chinese standardized curriculum is moving away completely from the rote-based learning to all project-based learning, tied to real-world work skills. Right.
Which is how most companies and successful companies work. They don't work in ISO. They don't work taking a test in a computer. They work as a team to accomplish a specific task.
In a decade, they flipped from rote learning to project-based learning and deeper learning principles. And they are on a faster adoption curve than what we are in the States on this, right? That was a calibration experience for me. It's like, wow, we better get serious about it. If we actually want to have more proficient kids who are ready for the workforce in the opportunities that are going to be created and are needed, right? The bar has completely shifted. And so what I hope, I saw our OECD scores, and that just hit the news the last. We've been here before. This was the late 80s, early 90s, right? And it spawned a decade of assessment to keep measuring how bad we are. And when you look back on all the measurement and high stakes testing and grading of schools and everything, and did it actually produce any improved results as sustained? Net over net, it's, as a country, not really. We're back to exactly where we were before, right? And so the idea of testing your way to the top doesn't work, because you got to learn your way to the top. And testing is only a snapshot of whether you can evidence of whether it worked or not.
Right.
Again, it's execution of learning that matters, not and whether the hype, and you do that work, the results on the assessments will be self-evident. So I'm just hoping that this time around, we're not going to go into the whole narrative. We got to raise standards. We got to raise standards. We got to raise standards. Like, we got to have better customer service. We better not lose as many packages, this year as we did last year if you're Federal Express, right? But none of that's going to matter if you're not changing the execution and changing your systems and changing the mindset of care and concern for and empathy for kids and your community. So one of the things that, and I think this is a really important polarity. We talked about the polarity of execution-based accountability versus goal-based accountability. This is another one, and there's a few other polarities that I won't get into tonight, but this is one that we found probably is the most powerful, is high-performance organizations, and especially schools, have a completely different polarity on this people first versus rigor first. So this narrative goes like this. So with a mediocre school or school district, when we say, oh, our test scores need to get improved, the first thing we got to raise standards, rigor, have more rigor, rigorous curriculum, rigorous this, rigorous, spend more time on it, right? And then for the kids that are struggling, okay, we got to figure out how to make things more relevant to them. So you have pull out courses and you try to make that happen. And then the kids that have the most trouble or are in trouble, they're the ones that have the relationships with adults. They're in the principal's office. Okay. That's kind of how most of education has been set up. Well, the schools that have completely different results, and we're not talking about 5% here. Now you're like double digit, 20% better outcomes than everybody else with the same kids. They start out with relationships that are the priority, because without the right trust relationships with your kids, you have no way to know what's relevant with them and what's going on with them. And without that, you have no way to actually know how to motivate them and inspire them to see what world class looks like for them to strive toward. And it's a complete different polarity. The same way, if you walk into a hotel before Marriott bought Starwood is having this huge problem, and their customer satisfaction was every year was falling. And they start to proceduralize and do more inspections and silent shoppers and all of this thing. And they would proceduralize everything. For example, they got to a point where I could walk in a Westin hotel. I would leave the room. I would run into a housekeeper with a cart in the hall, and they would, they would kind of come out to you and look at you in the eye and say, oh, good morning, right? I would go to the elevator, forgot something, go back to the room. I'd walk by the same cart, and they would do exactly the same thing again, because that's their procedure. It was rote, and I knew it was rote. It felt fake. And when you actually had a real problem for them to solve, they had no power to solve it. They had no intention to solve it. It wasn't what they were evaluated on, right? Ritz-Carlton, completely different mindset, relationships first. Not that you have to smile at the guest, but if I know who you are and there's notes in there and I walk in the door, maybe because you know the context that I'm here for a funeral of a family member, smiling at me and being all cheerful is not the appropriate, that's not relevant to what's going on, right? So
That makes sense.
So that polarity is so important. So when we get pressure for performance, and I think we spent 2 decades rigor first in so many cases, but then we have enough data. We have 30 years of even new tech and big picture and showing their results, and some of the other groups and districts that have taken relationships of people first approach, and they've executed well. They have completely different trajectories. And even with failing schools focusing on this, we've taken F-rated schools, charter schools that have already closed by authorizers. And when they flip this culture, they've gone full-term renewals, and they complete same principal, same teachers.
That makes sense.
This happened when implementing models in failing district schools as well. And it's not a 5-year, we're going to have this incremental improvement. You can flip this in a year.
That makes sense.
That's intentional.
So that model in an scalable way, in your opinion, could be a pathway to save public health. Now, before I let you go, guys, by the way, if you have questions, you can write in the chat, or you can, jump in kind of as we close it up. Ted, most educators are scared to death about about artificial intelligence. Literally, they cannot be more freak out. They say you see a lot of people like, oh yeah, embracing it and stuff like that. But when you really start asking questions, they're totally freak out about plagiarism, about student cheating, uh, et cetera, et cetera. They actually see me as a weirdo professor because I'm the one embracing AI and I'm trying to promote it as much as possible. Give me your take on that in terms of schooling and what how do you solve the pathway of educators and the mindset to embrace AI in a positive way.
So in the 1800s or earlier, the reason why we have books and the kind of lecture approach is that books were something was a book was something that maybe there was like one place in the whole community or the whole country that had that kind of articulation of knowledge, right? And so the whole point of a lecture was everyone could sit around, listen to someone reading a book, and they could basically transcribe it because they didn't have printing presses back then, right? You go far enough back. And
Right.
so it was and knowledge was incredibly, thin. I remember growing up as a kid, you had the World Encyclopedia. Think of how ridiculous that sounds these days,
Right.
right? So the difference is that at our fingertips, we have access to basically every piece of information out there, good or bad, in the universe on your phone, right? So the issue in learning is not about, do you remember the information? Can you find the information? The information is absolutely there. The question is, do you know what to do with it? That's the learning. So I would suggest that if we're so afraid of kids using any tool to come up with the answer, well, if the answer is already there, look it up. I'm okay with that. But any problem, any learning that's worth learning, we have so many problems, complex problems that's looking way past the things that we already know. Use any tool to find a hypothesis, a understand a system, understand what might be possible to solve a real problem that no one's solved, right? So if you move what the purpose of school and learning is to something more profound of not just not just learning answers that that's already there, but actually learning, then there's no threat from any use of any tool to try to figure out what's out there. Now, if we're expecting tools to be perfect and always give perfect information, just like every teacher gives perfect information, that doesn't happen, right? So that's where the discernment and the judgment and understanding that, and really understanding the information, and the imperfection of information to then solve problems. And I would argue that it's very obvious if you're in a PhD program, right? You're trying to solve
Right.
problems that no one else has solved.
1,000,000%.
I would say it's probably relevant for a master's program. Well,
Right.
what about a little kid? What's the difference? Right?
Right.
And we could say, oh, they need to learn the fundamentals of this and fundamentals of that. But the fastest way to learn the fundamentals of something is knowing where it's used and why you need to learn it and have it, explain how it's used, right?
1,000,000%.
And so there's this is where I'm a big learning by doing. This is how babies learn how to walk. They don't read a book.
Right.
They don't learn physics. They don't learn geometry. They learn by modeling, seeing, and if they decide to be a track runner, then they have another set of world-class calibrations with
Right.
coaches and seeing other people they're racing with to understand how to improve their performance, right?
Right. Right.
So the education system is too biased towards setting standards, which are basically minimum standards that
Right.
everyone can tolerate and pat each
Right.
other on the back with. And even with disadvantaged kids, what we found with working with new tech and giving them exposure to different environments, they're able to blow the lid off of any kind of performance expectations of adults. So whenever there's an underperforming system or school, it is always the adults keeping the lid on that performance.
That makes sense.
Not
No,
even
that makes sense.
intentionally, right? It's because of this goal setting, and everyone works toward that line, and it creates perverse behaviors that often are unintentional.
Okay, so to close it up, Ted, why don't you give in some kind of uh, some final words of encouragement to these fellow educators who are we're literally wired to change the world and create a better world through education, um, in terms of the variables that we're facing in the future, and what is within their control to improve public ed within the next years.
So you have a couple things in your control. One is you can search for and experience calibration experiences that are world class in education, in any kind of learning environment or company that has a really powerful learning environment. You have in your control to bring your teams to also experience world class things, because that is the gateway to then relook at what you actually have to do. And a lot of the bureaucracy that's been created is there because people don't know any better, and they're protecting this and that, right? So that exposure is so important. It helps you see clearly what I always encourage districts and organizations to do an annual audit of all their board and district and organizational policies. And when you have this clear picture, say we want to get from point A to point B, this world class and move in that direction, and we need to execute. And you see forget about all the policy. What would it take for us to actually execute? Then you can audit all your policies and say, does this policy help, hurt, or is neutral to allow us to execute in those directions? And that will clear a lot of the thorny brush of procedures and controls that are probably unnecessary. And it helps you tune all of your resources and processes and your people's energy to deliver on the core brand promise things that will make the difference. Most of the organizational performance problems are not because of the lack of effort. People are working extra hard at things, but they're working at the wrong things, and they don't even realize it. Or they're working at the wrong things because that's what the system has been designed to make them do. So in redesign of system, it's not about disruption. It's about seeing clearly the brand promise, the things that are required to deliver it, being very clear on what's getting in the way of that or what is helping that. And even when you have obstacles, even policy obstacles or regulatory obstacles, you have clarity on how you can either work around it or you can advocate directly for some flexibility or change in some of those regulations. So in the state of Indiana, when they were one of the first large a state that had a pretty large implementation of new techs at that time and early college, the state of Indiana created a blanket waiver process for any district that was going to implement a new tech or an early college. They had a blanket waiver of all ed code except for safety, soundness, and accountability. But pretty much everything else was automatically waived if they were certified to be part of one of those school design networks. That waiver was more flexible than the charter law that Indiana had. The districts had more flexibility because
Wow.
the state was in full agreement. We needed this. We want this. This is important to our workforce and our state's workforce competitiveness. We want this. And so tell us what you need to do, what we need to do to make it easier to make that happen. And
Right.
instead of having this incremental waiver here, waiver there that each district superintendent had to, go to ask for, said, well, if we trust the model and you guys are doing it, well, we'll give you a blanket waiver. So
Right.
these are these tools and mechanisms that when you have that clarity, you can actually start to carve out the pathway to actually get it done.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, I want to thank you, Ted, for your time, your knowledge, your wisdom. I wanna thank everybody for attending these. I recorded it, so I'm gonna share it with everybody. But I probably upload it to YouTube and then share it with everybody. But I appreciate you guys so much for showing up today and spending some time with my brother Ted and kind of he's so excited to me that he was able to share things that changed my life when he introduced it to me years ago, and hopefully continue bringing these to everybody through our work together. So one more time, Ted, thank you so much, and God bless you, everybody, and I'll
I'll
see you
say
soon.
thank you everybody too. And I know this is triggering. We call that putting monkeys in your brain, and you'll be thinking about this in different ways. I think Antonia and I would welcome kind of we have a reflection protocol of basically think your I wonder questions. So I wonder dot 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 or my aha when I heard all this stuff, right? Share that and we'll do our best. I'll do my best to respond. But what do you want
100%.
based on what you heard? What do you wonder about? And then what were your ahas based on this?
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much,
My
everybody.
pleasure.
And
Thank you.
I'm gonna leave the chat open. Thank you to all my friends for being here, and we'll continue working together. All right. Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody. Be good.
Yeah.
Ahí con Dios.